blood, memory, freedom's echo. In post-Civil War America, many who had been enslaved now held a new burden: to speak themselves into history. For decades, their voices were silent in archives and textbooks until the U.S. Pension Bureau compelled them to tell their stories. These were not just statements for benefits. They were living testimonies by men and women who bore witness to bondage, war, and emancipation. One of them was Dick Lewis Barnett, a veteran of the 77th United States Colored Infantry. When questioned in 1911, he recounted being born on a plantation in Montgomery County, Alabama. His mother, Phyllis, was a slave under Saul Smith. His identity was tangled. The name Dick Lewis Smith appears in his records until he claimed the name Barnett after learning his father's name. He told of drifting into Florida, then escaping to New Orleans, and in 1864 enlisting for the Union under Company B of the USCI. Barnett even served as a drummer, not a frontline rifleman, but his story carried weight nonetheless. He recalled that after the war, he farmed, moved across states, waited decades to apply for a pension, and in the process, resurrected a history nearly buried. Another name emerges in these pension files: Charles Washington, who testified in 1905. He described being born in Florida, passed through the hands of multiple owners from childhood, and the agony of being sold, repeatedly, across state lines. Washington described how his mother told him his age only when he turned 12 and that he lost track of time by seasons, not calendars. He spoke of arriving in Louisiana, being forced into new masters, and living life in fractured pieces. Yet he lived, and finally, he testified. And there was Mary Jane Taylor, a widow whose record revealed the tensions of marriage under slavery and after. Mary Jane had once lived under informal union, unrecognized by law during bondage. When her husband, Samuel Taylor, died, officials questioned whether her marriage was valid. She had to prove that her relationship, childbearing, and family bond were real, despite decades of dehumanization that violated the legal norms of marriage itself. These voices, recorded in cold bureaucratic files, defy their formality. They tell of whippings, of separations, of mothers sold and children left behind. They tell of a people who survived. The pension examiners asked about health, disability, identity, and lineage, but the responses revealed something far more: the psyche of survival. They spoke because they had to. They spoke because there was no one else to speak for them. Each deposition was their declaration: I existed, I suffered, I remember. These narratives have been preserved, not by the grandeur of monuments, but by the weight of questions asked: name, date, lineage, service. And within those questions lay rebellion. The older men revealed how they were sold, how they handled trade, how they understood time. They measured years by harvests, by births, by the passing of seasons, not by calendars that were alien to them. For many, pension files are a richer reservoir of memory than the WPA slave narratives collected later. They are closer to slavery itself, not diluted by decades of retelling. National Archives. Here, a man tells how he gained his name. There, a woman shows how in bondage, her union meant more love than law ever gave. These voices are the bridge between silence and history. This is their testimony. This is voices of emancipation. Their stories pause the present and force us to remember freedom is not just legal emancipation, but voice. Their memory is our inheritance. Deposition of Dick Lewis Barnett to a special examiner. May 17, 1911, Okmulgee, Oklahoma.
I am 65 years of age. My post office address is Okmulgee, Oklahoma. I am a farmer. My full name is Dick Lewis Barnett. I am the applicant for pension on account of having served in Company B, 77th U.S. Cavalry and Company D, U.S. Colonel H. Art, under the name Lewis Smith, which was the name I wore before. The days of slavery were over. I am the identical person who served in the said companies under the name of Lewis Smith. I am the identical person who was named, called, and known as Dick Lewis Smith before the Civil War and during the Civil War, and until I returned home after my military service. I enlisted in April 1864 at the Toro Building, New Orleans, Louisiana, in Company B, 77 U.S. Colonel Infantry, L.A. troops, and served with that company until the whole company was transferred to Company D-10, U.S.C. Heavy Artillery. We were transferred in October 1865, and I served till my discharge February 20, 1867 at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I enlisted as Lewis Smith and served as a musician. My duty was to beat a drum. A drummer and musician are the same things. My fifer was James Harrison. I camped right with my company all the time. During all my service, we were stationed at New Orleans and between Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Fort St. Philip, and at Camp Parapet. I was born in Montgomery County, Alabama, the child of Phyllis Houston, slave of Saul Smith. When I was born, my mother was known as Phyllis Smith, and I took the name of Smith, too. I was called mostly Lewis Smith till after the war, although I was named Dick Lewis Smith. Dick was the brother of John Barnett, whom I learned was my father after I got back from the war, when my mother told me that John Barnett was my father. I was raised on Saul Smith's plantation near Montgomery, Alabama, and I stayed there till December 1862 when I went to Cedar Key, Florida, 60 miles from Key West, Florida, with Jacob Smith, my master's son, and from there I went to New Orleans, Louisiana. Christmas 1863 and the next February 1864 or March 1864, I enlisted in the U.S. service in Company B, 77th Colonel Infantry, but I was not sworn in until April 1864. I had no Confederate service. Lieutenant Marshal of Company B and D got me to enlist. My colonel was Charles A. Hartwell. My lieutenant colonel was named Street, but he did not stay with us after our transfer because he said something about the Army which General Butler proposed to court-martial him for, and we did not see him anymore. I cannot name any majors nor any surgeons. I have forgotten the name of my captain in County B, I cannot say. Wingate was captain of Company A. My captain in Company D was Charles Bailey, and my lieutenant was named Dunham. Lieutenant Marshal was a different person. George Abbott, Moberly, Missouri, Peter Grant, Stephen Storr, Callaway Company Mo, both of whom I saw last February, Solomon Sylvester, John Robinson, Sergeant James Harrison, A. King Sergeant Thomas Brown, Ben Ballard, O.G.'s George, a Creole, George Mitchell Austin French, George Hatton Curly Simmons. I was a stranger to my comrades when I enlisted. After the service, I saw none of them until last February when I called on Abbott and Grant to get their affidavits for use in my pension claim. When I got home after the war, I was wearing the name of Lewis Smith, but I found that the Negroes after freedom were taking the names of their father like the white folks. So I asked my mother, and she told me, my father, John Barnett, a white man, and I took up the name of Barnett. I was a mulatto, brown eyes, black year, 17 years of age, I think, and my height was very near 5 feet. Place of birth was Montgomery, Alabama, and occupation was tending cattle and working about the house of my master, Saul Smith. I had an Army discharge, and I kept it for years and years. We kept it with other papers in a bureau drawer, and we kept the papers for so long that we took some of the papers out of bureau, and they got scattered, and the Army discharge got lost. I here read the list of comrades, and I recall all of them except Nelson, alias Foxwell. Some were Creole. A great many were unable to talk English plainly. Geo Kyle, deceased, Montgomery, Alabama, was in company. K-77 US, and I knew him before service. James Harrison, Pfeiffer, was my bunkmate. During my service, I was sunstruck in first March, about a month after I was sworn in, and I had a fever with sunstroke and did not get over it by the time I was transferred. After my enlistment, my company was stationed at New Orleans for about 5 weeks, and then we marched to Camp Chalmette, 3 miles south of New Orleans, for 4 days, and then we went up the river to Camp Parapet, where we stayed till our transfer to artillery. I was sick all the time at Parapet, Louisiana, and I was taken to a hospital, but I escaped after a day and went back to my tent, for so many men were dying. From Parapet, we went to Fort St. Philip and stayed there 6 or 8 months, till about July 1866, when we were called to fight the rioters in New Orleans. And on our way up the river to New Orleans, Louisiana, the boat we were on sank, and Lieutenant Dunham took the wheel and ran the boat to shore, and we jumped off, and I fell in the water with my drum on me. After we got to New Orleans, our regiment lost a white major, name forgotten, through sickness, and a private named Henry Dupree died on account of eating too much ice cream. I was in no battle or engagement with the enemy. But at Parapet, the 11th Rhode Island Artillery got into a row with men in my regiment, and several volleys were fired without anyone being hurt. Soon after I enlisted, it was proposed that my company go to Texas to fight Indians or Mexicans, but our people opposed it, and we did not go.